the whole idea behind conflict of interest is that science should be unbiased. And that means that as we're doing an experiment, or designing an experiment, or designing any kind of study, our only goal should be to find out the truth, to test our hypothesis. And there's, of course, a little bit of a fallacy in that usually if, let's say, you write a grant application saying, I think such and such is true and I want to test that hypothesis, well, it's true that if your hypothesis turns out to be wrong, you're not going to, ignore that result. But, you really do have a bit of a bias in that probably if you've posed a hypothesis to test, it's one that you would prefer if it were true. And in many ways, it would be better for you in a lot of ways if it is true than it isn't. Sometimes we pose a hypothesis, where we really think maybe it's not true. Maybe, for example, we might say, well, such and such is generally believed, but I believe that that's not true, and I'm going to test it and prove that it's not true. Because generally, the purpose of your experiments is to show something new is actually the case. So, sometimes disproving a hypothesis may be important, but in general, most research projects are kind of designed saying there's a hypothesis that we think is true, and we're testing it. Very often I read grant applications, especially written by young people, and they say, we're doing these experiments to prove that such and such is true. And I always think it's better to say, we're doing these experiments to test whether such and such is true. Because hopefully, even if the answer comes out that your hypothesis is wrong, you will be a good enough scientist and honest enough to realize that, and then perhaps that will lead you to come to an even better hypothesis. And certainly, in my own research career, I've often changed my hypothesis as a project was ongoing because new data indicated that what I thought was the case simply was not. So, to some extent, we always have a conflict of interest because, we write a grant and we predict that certain things are likely to be found in the course of that grant, and we have an interest in those predictions being correct. So we have a conflict of interest if data come up that don't meet our expectations. But of course, that's probably true for all scientists. So usually when we talk about conflict of interest, what we're really talking about is financial conflict of interest. So let's say if I'm testing whether a certain drug works to treat cancer, I presumably am an unbiased tester of that drug. Now if, let's say, I own several thousand shares of the company that produces that drug, and that drug is the only product that this little biotechnology company produces, my shares might right now be worth absolutely nothing unless I have a room I want to wallpaper. But on the other hand, if the drug turns out to really work, those shares may be worth a phenomenal amount of money. So now I have a real bias if that's the case, because it will make a big difference to me whether I make this $1 million off this stock or I just toss it in the garbage. So would I really be unbiased? Now, one might say, and I think a lot of people used to think this was the case, well, scientists are scientists, and it's certainly not an unreasonable thing for a scientist based on their knowledge of science to buy stock or to have an advisory role in a pharmaceutical company or a chemical company or an information processing company of some sort, some kind of technology company. I mean, who else, after all, is better equipped to do that? And aren't we, under the terms of the Bayh-Dole Act, there are a number of, reasons why we are encouraged as academic scientists to see that our ideas come into practical fruition. We're not just doing science if we're working, let's say, in biomedical research for the purpose of, of putting things in journals that will be stored in the library shelves somewhere, but we're kind of hoping that what we're doing is going to, help make better diagnostic tests or better understanding of diseases so we can develop new treatments. And that's going to involve developing products that are going to, in addition to making someone some money, help the human condition. So isn't it good that academic scientists are involved in companies that are doing technology development? I mean, who better should be involved in that? And since we all know that we're honestly in science because of our desire to do good things, what's the problem if we also are, at the same time that we're being good academic scientists, own some stock in Merck or Pfizer or a little biotech company that's starting up around the corner? And one of the problems, of course, is appearance. In other words, if I am doing experiments and depending one result of that experiment will make me a lot of money and the other result will not, well, maybe I'm biased. And even if I'm not biased, it will look to the public like I'm biased. So one thing that's often said on this conflict of interest is sunshine is the best disinfectant. So we are required to disclose our conflicts of interest. So if you pick up almost any medical journal, certainly I know New England Journal does this, Journal of the AMA does this, and probably most biomedical journals do it, especially the more medically oriented ones. You'll look at the list of authors on the front of the paper, and it will list the names, and after each name there'll be a little footnote that will say, acknowledges research support from GlaxoSmithKline and owns stock in Pfizer and Merck and serves as an advisor for Burroughs Wellcome or something like that. And people disclose their conflicts of interest. So right away, if I'm writing about a drug that a company makes, someone will know, well, either, I work for that company or maybe I work for the competitor of that company. And they might put in the back of their mind, well, maybe we should take that into account as we're reading this paper. And that's true. So basically, funding sources, whether it's funding for me personally, because I own stock in a company, or funding sources as who gives me the money to do the research, can make a big difference. And more important than that, can make a big difference in how it's perceived. There have been a lot of scandals that I'm sure you've heard about recently where drugs have been recalled, and the FDA has often, the question has been asked, why did the FDA approve such and such a drug? And then someone goes back and says, well, let's look at the people who sat on the FDA panel as consultants when this drug was approved. And it turns out that 60% of the people in that panel owned stock in the company that made the drug. Now, those people presumably were still being honest scientists, but it wasn't revealed right up front. Now, maybe it's impossible. I mean, I was just talking to a former student of mine who works in FDA regulations for some of the biotech companies, and he said, look, if I'm the FDA and I want to bring in experts on painkillers to approve a new painkiller, all the biggest experts are going to be the people who are developing painkillers for pharmaceutical companies. Who else can I get? So maybe you have to get those people. But the point is, if up front the conflicts of interests are disclosed, then right away the questions can be asked in a timely fashion. But of course, there are other conflicts of interest that we're not talking about. For example, professional advancement. I have an NIH grant. I'm an assistant professor. If my NIH grant gets renewed, I'm highly likely to get promoted. If my NIH grant doesn't get renewed, I'm highly unlikely to get promoted. I have a conflict of interest. I'm very biased in how I want these results to turn out. But of course, that's true for all science, so that is kind of ignored. But you have to realize that everyone, to a certain extent, has a conflict of interest. And of course, as we discussed previously, a reviewer can have a conflict of interest, and that's a problem for grant reviews and paper reviews, and again, something that has to be controlled for. So one way of viewing conflict of interest is a definition here is when secondary interests, financial and many others, unduly influence professional judgment concerning a primary interest, which is the actual scientific research that you're doing. And this may be an actual or potential personal or institutional conflict of interest or the appearance of such a conflict. And again, as we mentioned, the Bayh-Dole Act mandates commercialization of government-funded university research discoveries, that also raises the issue that the entire university can have a conflict of interest. I mean, there was an example a few years ago, which I'm sure you've read about, in which a young, relatively healthy person in a trial of gene therapy for a disease, this was an inherited disease, but this person was 18 years old and in relatively good health, but had this genetic disease, and went to University of Pennsylvania Hospital and enrolled in a clinical trial and was given gene therapy that was going to correct the disease. And unfortunately, and this was totally unpredicted, there was a bad complication from that therapy, and in fact the patient died. Subsequently, it turned out that there were some indications in some animal studies that there might have been some risks in this therapy which had not been adequately stressed. Then it turned out that the investigator who was running the therapy owned stock in the company that was making the drug. But it also turned out that the university owned stock in the company that was making the drug. And that looked very bad. So, again, you know, I don't think anyone actually intended that this patient should die. I think they all would have much rather that didn't happen, but it may have clouded their judgment. And certainly having it come out after the fact that there was a conflict of interest looked very bad for the university. This is really in my opinion, one of the top few universities in the country. So, you know, even the high and mighty are not beyond having problems in this area, and it's something that's being increasingly addressed because of problems like that having happened. Now, there's a very high standard. As I said, it's not only conflict of interest, but even the appearance of conflict of interest, and that's because other people can't really determine what influences an investigator. And we all depend on trust, and if there's any doubt about that trust, that's potentially disastrous for us. Now, conflict of interest is important in all research, but as I said earlier, there's much more regulation of this when it relates to patients, because obviously there's a different level of risk. If you're doing some kind of abstract science and your conflict of interest leads you to do something wrong, well, that's not good. But if you're doing work on developing a new drug and your conflict of interest causes something not to be adequately done right, well, that can potentially kill people. So both regulatory authorities and the public are much more concerned about that. To give you an idea, I was talking to one of the students at our medical school, and he had, well, he was in his third year of medical school, written up a case study that he had worked on. And it was just a little article, you know, about a page and a half, that was going to be submitted, you know, as a letter to New England Journal of Medicine. And he described to me how, in order to submit an article to the New England Journal of Medicine, he had to fill out a conflict of interest form documenting that he didn't own stock, and he didn't sit on the board of directors, and he didn't, you know, wasn't an executive and wasn't of a drug company. And he filled out a conflict of interest form that was 14 pages long. This is just for a page and a half article. And then he was absolutely heartbroken when the journal rejected the article. He said, it wasn't so hard writing the article, but the conflict of interest form was really tough. So, but there is a good reason for that. So again, clinical research, more tightly regulated. Now, does it really matter? As I said, you know, maybe everyone is honest, and this is just window dressing. So here's some results. This is from a paper that was published in 2003, and what they did is they looked at 603 consecutive papers and presentations on leg orthopedic implants. And when they looked at hip implants, they found that among the commercially funded publications on hip implants, 93% came out with positive results. When they looked at the studies of hip implants that were funded, let's say, by the NIH or people like that, 37% of the published studies had positive results. That's quite a difference. When they looked at knee replacements, you see similar numbers. And when they looked at investigators who received royalties from the companies that made the hip implants, not one of those investigators published a negative outcome on their studies. And of course, that's an important place where you can control things, right? You could do a study and get a bad result. You say, yeah, I got a bad result. I'm putting that in the file cabinet. Forget about that one. Go do something else. You know? So, except if that's not so good for the people who are getting that device implanted. So here you see that, you know, I mean, these were all in the same journals, people who are on the faculty of reputable medical schools. So there really is a difference depending on funding. Generally, the rule of thumb is it's about a threefold difference in how likely the result is to be positive, whether it's funded by a commercial operation and whether it's funded by an agency. So just how widespread is this problem? And here's an interesting study that was published last year. That was a study done in 2007, and they looked at over 1,600 faculty at 50 medical schools. And they found that 52% of those faculty had some relationship with industry. 41% had a relationship that related to their most important research. And 20% had industrial funding. Of course, when you go to clinical trials, about half of those had industrial funding. After all, who pays for clinical trials? People who want to develop new drugs. So it makes sense. The average industry funding per year of each of these investigators was $33,000. And the average funding for clinical trial principal investigators was over $100,000. So we're already talking about some serious research funding here. So again, if someone's giving you $100,000 a year for your research, you kind of want to make them happy. So institutions now, because of this, have developed ways of regulating the conflict of interest. And this is a growing problem because we are all directed to commercialize our inventions. We as faculty and our universities want to see patents come out and have those patents get licensed to bring the university money. So we have financial conflicts of interest as well as intellectual bias and also conflicts of commitment. And these conflicts of commitment, again, can be a problem. I really worry about it when I read, you know, as I have in the New York Times, that some person who is a faculty member at some prestigious medical school is so valued as a consultant by industry that that person's industrial contracts as a consultant bring them 5 times as much salary as they make by their university appointment. Because then I say, well, if this person's making 5 times as much consulting for industry as they are as being a professor, how committed are they to their role as a professor, as a scientist? That's a potential problem. And again, as we look at the particular conflicts, the thing that's most regulated is strictly financial. And probably one of the reasons why it is most regulated, because it's easiest to measure. You know, it's hard to say, how does one feel about something, but it's easy to measure how much money did you put in your pocket from this product. That's an easy thing to do. And so for financial conflict of interest, basically when you fill out a form, the main question they ask you is, have you gotten any salary or other payments from outside sources? And generally, the threshold that the NIH has used is if you get $10,000 a year or more. So, you know, if I serve on a study section, I give occasional talks at different universities, I may even give occasional talks to pharmaceutical companies, I make a few $100s here, $1,000 there. If it doesn't add up to $10,000, you know, I can check off no conflict of interest. Also equity. And here again, for equity, the limit is $10,000 or 5% of the shares. So for example, if I own, you know, 3 or 4 shares of a drug company, they're worth a few $100s, no one cares. But if I own enough to be 10,000, well, then that's money. Now, the 5% can be a problem. So, for example, a few years ago, it never wound up going anywhere, but I was involved with a group of other scientists on our campus in starting a startup biotechnology company. And when we first started this biotechnology company, as often happens, you know, each of us owned stock in this company. Now, the company had a net value of 0. In fact, if you really calculated it carefully, it probably had a net value of less than 0. But, and in fact, it eventually went out of business for that reason. And then the way companies often get started is you may have 3 or 4 inventors who get together and they've invented something and say, okay, we each own 33% of this company. And then you hope that the company is going to go somewhere, so then you go to people who have money and you say, would you like to invest in the company? And the people say, okay, I'll invest in your company if you give me half of the company. So what happens is you may start off owning more than 5% of the company, but if the company is going to have any real existence, you will undoubtedly pretty soon own less than 5%. But there probably was a few days there in the early days of this company where had I had to fill out one of these forms, I might have had to check off a box saying, no, I own 6% of this company. I have a conflict of interest, even if it's not worth $10,000. Because the idea being it's such a significant percentage that even if it's not worth anything, it might bias me because it might be worth nothing now, but boy, if this thing turns out to work, it might be worth something someday. So one thing you should be aware of, these cutoffs are going to be changing. There are currently hearings going on at the NIH, and they're considering reducing this level to $5,000. So that will be a change that will probably go into effect. Another thing that might be a conflict of interest that you have to list is intellectual property rights. So supposing I own a patent along with my, well, actually the university will own the patent, but let's say I have a share of that patent in our university, like most universities. If something I invent gets patented, the university takes out the patent and then tries to sell the patent or license the patent to companies, but in fact I own a piece of it. And you know, if the patent gets sold for a lot of money, I'll get a piece of that money. Well, if I get a grant to study the thing that I've invented, and after all, who better to study something I've invented than me? Well, I have a bias because my worthless patent, if this thing actually turns out to be a drug, will all of a sudden be worth money. So what do I do about that? And again, we'll go into that, but it would be the responsibility of the university. Once I check that box off yes, which I would have to check off and I have to explain, then the university would have to come up with a plan before I could accept a grant to work on that of how that conflict of interest would be removed. Or the university might have to say, you can't do that research. Someone else will have to do that research because you would have a conflict of interest if the conflict can't be removed. Okay, now the other thing about the conflict of interest is when you're checking off that box yes or no, you're also checking it off for any of your relatives. So, for example, the chairman of my department founded a biotech company, which in fact is very successful. His son right now is the president of that biotech company. But he still has to check off that he has a conflict of interest because of that biotech company, because presumably he and his son are on good speaking terms. So you can't get rid of a conflict of interest saying, well, I'm giving these shares to my wife or husband or to my brother-in-law or to my cousin, and now I don't have a conflict of interest anymore. And you should also be aware that different institutions may have different thresholds. Now, for example, at Harvard, where some of the worst scandals had been reported, I mean, obviously people at Harvard are very famous, and if you're in a pharmaceutical company and you want to bring in a big name who has a lot of prestige to work for your company, what better place to get them than Harvard Medical School? And so Harvard has now established that basically if the drug company is giving you anything more than a pencil with their logo on it, you have to report that as a conflict of interest. And that's much stricter, let's say, than the rules at my university or the rules at the NIH. I would imagine probably much stricter than the rules at UPR as well. So again, you should be aware as you move around later on in your careers that each company and each university may have their own rules for conflicts of interest, and you have to follow them. So again, self-regulation is a great idea, but it has not worked. And so hence we have the rule that sunshine is the best disinfectant. So everyone should disclose their conflicts of interest. So for example, if you're involved in a study involving patients and you have a conflict of interest, many people would say, well, when you have the patients sign up for that study and they have to sign their agreement to do so, you should include in that paperwork the fact that the investigator has a conflict of interest. Now, how are the subjects going to feel about that? Is that going to be a problem for them? Maybe you're putting them under stress. Maybe it would be better for them not to know. Some people have argued you shouldn't do that. But I think in the long run, especially for clinical things, conflicts of interest are going to have to be, first of all, are going to have to be exposed, disclosed, and in many cases they're going to have to be eliminated. So how might conflicts of interest be eliminated? Well, you could, for example, appoint a monitor to say, okay, this investigator has a conflict of interest, so we're going to appoint another faculty member who does not report to the person with the conflict of interest to monitor all the results of this study and determine what gets published and whether negative results are being adequately reported. Or you might say, okay, we're going to tell the person, if you want to do this study, you have to sell your stock in that company right now, and we'll put that money into a blind trust, and the blind trust will simply invest it and manage it for as long as you're doing this project. And you will have no idea whether that money is actually in this company or not, and then you will be unbiased. So, or they may simply say a prohibition. There are such cases where it may come up, especially in clinical studies, where they say, look, there's no way this person can be unbiased in this study, so even though this person has a track record in this area, maybe they're the ones who invented this drug that we're going to test, they can't be the ones who actually do the test, because there's no way they can be unbiased. Now, when I say biased, I don't want you to think, like when I showed those tables where we saw the different results from industry-funded and and academically funded, institutionally funded projects. I don't think that those industrial-funded people were, committing, falsification or fabrication. But there are a lot of opportunities where, if you're running a study, you have the opportunity to make certain decisions, and decision-making is really where the problem lies. Because after all, you can decide like not to publish or not to publish, or you can decide, well, I'm going to measure tumor growth by an X-ray, or I'm going to measure tumor growth by how the patient feels on a survey. So you can do all different kinds of things, or you can decide I'm comparing the drug to a placebo, or I'm comparing the drug to another drug. And in a lot of cases, that will make a big difference in how the study turns out. So again, early disclosure and complete disclosure is the important thing here. Now, who needs to disclose? That's an important thing, because when you submit a grant application or you submit a paper, in fact, every investigator has to disclose conflict of interest. So if I write a grant, basically every person whose name appears on that grant has to sign a conflict of interest statement. The university has to collect that information, and the NIH relies on the university to do that administrative job. The NIH only has to be notified if there is a conflict. So if I write a grant that supports me, well, my name is obviously on it, so I have to sign that. My collaborator in another lab has to sign it. My graduate student has to sign it. My technician has to sign it. And if I name a secretary, the secretary has to sign it. That may seem a little extreme because I don't think the secretary is going to have a lot of, well, I guess they could change the results while we're submitting a paper, but probably wouldn't. But that is the rule. So anyone who is involved in the design, conduct, or reporting of sponsored research has to report conflict of interest or explicitly state that there is no conflict of interest. And in reporting that, they're also signing for their spouse and family. When do you have to report conflict of interest? Obviously, when you write a grant, and also when you receive a grant, and also whenever a new conflict of interest is identified. So, for example, if I already have a grant, and one day I'm having lunch with my chairman, and I mention to him, oh, you know, we're starting a new biotech company. And my chairman then should say to me, day 0, you have 60 days to report that. Because now that could be a conflict of interest. So within 60 days of the discovery of any conflict of interest, it has to be reported and managed, reduced, or eliminated. Because after all, these things can change not only at the time you're applying for a grant, but might apply once a grant is ongoing. So the basic way, how is it decided if a conflict of interest is a problem? Well, one way is by the amount of money. Obviously, the more money involved, the worse the conflict of interest. Presumably, if I'm getting a few $1,000s from a company, that's not going to bias me. But if I'm getting lots and lots of money, like I say, many investigators may be getting more money from a company than they get from their salary. Well, that could potentially be a bias. Also, the level of responsibility of the person in that outside activity. So, you know, if I, you know, happen to own some stock in a drug company, but I'm not really involved in that drug company other than owning that stock, well, that's one level of investment, of involvement. But supposing I'm a member of the board of scientific advisors of a pharmaceutical company, well, now I'm directly involved in the operations of that company. That's more of a conflict of interest than just owning stock. Also, how involved am I in decision making in the research? If I'm the PI, I have a lot of control. If I'm a person who comes in and consults with the PI once a year to see how things are going, you know, I may not have much control over that research at all. And my conflict of interest may not matter much. So again, that could be a difference. And this is something that has to be decided by the university and then reported to the funding agency. It also has to be, by the way, put into any publications. So for example, at our school, some kinds of conflict of interests are allowed. So you know, I'm allowed to receive royalties. I'm allowed to, if I want to open the Leibowitz consulting company so that I can come and give conflict of interest lectures at universities in warm places in the winter, I could start a company to do that, and I could own that company, and that would be okay as far as my university is concerned. I haven't done that, by the way. Or if I, you know, very often if I sit on an NIH review panel or I edit or any other review panels, very often I'll receive a small check as an honorarium for that, and you know, that is not considered to be a conflict of interest that's allowed. I don't have to report that. But again, those checks are very small, and it's presumably not going to influence me. And also, they're generally, you know, coming from people like the NIH and not from drug companies. Again, these are some of the things where decision making by an investigator could alter the results depending on, you know, of a trial. So for example, you can decide what, in a clinical trial, you could decide what is it we're going to test. Are we going to test improvement in a disease, or are we going to test some variation in some lab test? Are we going to compare with a placebo or with something that works? What endpoint are we going to use? Inclusion and exclusion criteria. Are we going to do this on the very sickest patients or on the least sick patients? How is the informed consent document going to be worded? When are we going to stop the trial, either for good or bad reasons? How are we going to stop the trial based on published results from other trials? Which patients will be enrolled in the study? These are all decisions which can influence the outcome, which hopefully will be made only on the basis of the best possible science, not on the basis of payoff. Another important thing is the reporting of negative results. Now, there is a natural tendency not to report negative results. You know, if I come up with a hypothesis that no one believes, and I test that hypothesis, and it turns out that it's wrong, I'll probably have a very hard time finding a journal that wants to publish my paper, because it isn't that interesting. On the other hand, if I'm testing a drug in clinical research, it may be very important to publish a negative result. I mean, if there's a drug out there and it doesn't work, you know, we have to let people know about it, first of all, so no one takes that drug, and also to save the time of other investigators, so no one else tests that drug. So negative results are very, very important. But on the other hand, publishing them isn't very useful for the corporate sponsor. And there have been a number of scandals, for example, where companies have gone to universities and hired faculty at the universities to do a clinical study, test whether our drug works. The faculty does the clinical study and finds out that the drug doesn't work. And the company says, that's very nice, but you signed a piece of paper that says we have the right to determine whether or not you can publish your results. And we don't think you should publish your results, and we'll take you to court if you try publishing your results. So that's a problem. That's a conflict of interest. It's now generally considered unacceptable for any academic scientist to sign such a document. 10 years ago it was acceptable, and it was done. And there are cases where these things did go to court. So, you know, that is no longer allowed. So that's something you should be aware of. And that's one of the reasons why when a drug company comes to a faculty member and says, we want to sponsor your research, usually some kind of a contract will have to be signed, and whatever university you're at, whether it's UPR or elsewhere, the university will say, you can't sign that contract as a faculty member. We want the university lawyers to look at it first, because they want to make sure that you don't inadvertently sign away the university's rights to publish the paper. So that's very important. Now, for clinical trials, it's now required since 2005, for clinical trials to be registered. So when you do a clinical trial, you've got a new knee prosthesis, you've got a new drug, and you're testing it in people, that is supposed to be registered at an online site so everyone can see, this is the trial, this is when it started, this is when it stopped or when it's planned for it to be stopped, this is the end point we're testing, and this is the result, whether it's positive or negative. And presumably everyone, whether they're your competitor or the general public or a scientist who's designing a new trial of their own, can go to that site and check to see whether the trial has actually been done. And presumably negative results should be just as likely to be there as positive results. So we solved the whole problem. Why am I giving this lecture? So in 2008, 3 years later, a study was done that was, they looked at 323 trials in cardiology, rheumatology, and gastroenterology in the 10 top journals in those fields. They found that only 45% had registered before the end of the trial with the outcomes to be measured. 27% had not registered at all. 14% had registered, but only after the trial was completed. 10% didn't clearly state the outcomes. And in 31%, there was a discrepancy between the outcomes registered and the actual outcomes published. And that's a real problem when you think about it, because when you're measuring clinical variables, or you go to the doctor, you get a lab test done, you get a number, and then beside the number, in parentheses, it says these are the normal values. What the normal values mean is that's the values within which 95% of healthy people will have a result on that test. So what that says is if you test 20 people, let's say for cholesterol level, who have normal cholesterol, 1 out of those 20 will have a number that's outside the normal range, at least on that one test. Because that's how the normal is defined. So the thing you don't want to do in a clinical study is start the study without a previous outcome that's indicated before you do the study. So, otherwise you could do a study. Here's a good study, right? We'll give patients a drug, we'll test 50 things, and we'll report which things are outside the levels we expect. Well, we would expect about two of those things will be okay, so we're going to get a result. That's not a good clinical study. So that's why it's important to register the outcomes first. So again, this problem still exists and may in part be due to the influence of sponsors. Again, this is less of a problem for people in non-clinical areas. Now, it's interesting that there are some differences here in fees, and this is if you're practicing medicine, and let's say you have 2 doctors, one of whom is a gastroenterologist, one of whom is a cardiologist. You could say, I'll tell you what, we'll make a deal. The gastroenterologist will refer all of his heart patients to the cardiologist. The cardiologist will refer all of his gastroenterological patients to the gastroenterologist, and they'll each give each other $100 for every patient they refer as a finder's fee. Sounds like a good deal. It's illegal. You go to jail for doing that. Okay? You're not allowed, a doctor in practice is not allowed to pay for referrals. In fact, at our university, they found some people who were doing that. They got in big trouble. However, in science, very often, as you're doing patient studies, in fact, there are fees for patient recruitment that are paid. And this is an interesting area in terms of how do you think about that? Well, it is done, but is it a problem? And I think that's something you may want to keep an eye on in the future because these rules are likely to change in the future. If you're interested in conflict of interest, there are a lot of rules about them. Again, as I said, most of them relate specifically to clinical research, but for any research there are rules. Most of the work I do is not involving human subjects, but still, for every grant I write and most papers I have to fill out conflict of interest forms. If I was doing clinical work, I would have to fill out a lot more involved conflict of interest forms. Okay, are there any questions before we go on to cases? Okay. Okay, so here's the first case. Cynthia Walsh is an associate professor of medicine and a prominent academic cardiologist. Her personal financial investments include significant stock holdings in 3 publicly traded biotechnology firms. She's approached by one of these firms to be a lead investigator in a therapeutic trial of a novel agent for preventing tissue damage from myocardial infarction. This will be a randomized, double-blinded, placebo-controlled clinical trial where neither the patient nor the physician will know whether the drug under investigation or a placebo is being used in a given patient. Dr. Walsh is quite familiar with the preliminary animal and cell work in the area and believes that there is an excellent chance that this new drug will result in a significant improvement in survival and reduce damage to the heart muscle. She even thinks that this novel agent may reduce the risk of heart failure and irregular beats. Dr. Walsh's group is one of the few cardiology groups fully prepared to carry out this investigation, which is why she was contacted, and a clinical fellow suited to manage the study is available. She cares for a large number of patients with MI and believes that she could enroll numerous patients efficiently. The drug will, by the way, the commonest reason why clinical trials fail is lack of adequate patient enrollment. So getting the adequate number of patients is a big plus when one is considering where to do a clinical trial. The drug will only be available to her patients if her group participates in the trial. The company is offering $5,000 for each patient enrolled, and the money would really help both her salary and the division budget. As lead investigator, she will be much better known and will likely experience an increase in referral if the trial succeeds. Sounds like a great situation. Is Dr. Walsh's participation in this study appropriate? Well, take a vote. How many say yes? How many say no? Okay, so there are some problems here. Obviously you think she has a conflict of interest, so what is that conflict and how could it be managed? Mm-hmm. That could be a problem. Is there any way they could solve that problem so she could still participate? Yeah. So at a minimum, she would probably have to get rid of that stock. But even then, that's still, this is a real problem. It's quite common in these kinds of studies to pay an investigator for their effort in enrolling patients, but the question is how much, at what point does that level of pay become such an amount that it represents a conflict of interest, and that would have to be considered here. But certainly the stock would be a problem. Okay. If Dr. Walsh already believes the drug is an improvement based on the literature emanating from animal experiments, can she honestly assign patients randomly to treatment or placebo? What if she believes the drug is deleterious because of its adverse effects on the kidney late in the course of treatment? So what do you think of that? Well, I guess most of you probably aren't involved in clinical trials, but one of the questions that has to be asked when you're doing a clinical trial where you're comparing a drug and a placebo or comparing one treatment and another treatment is there has to be something called clinical equipoise. So you have to set up the trial in such a way that there is question in anyone's mind whether treatment A or treatment B overall is really the better thing. So the way this question is worded is exactly why such a study could be done. You might say, look, there's a lot of evidence that this drug is going to work. Well, if that's the case, why don't we just put everyone on the drug? There also may be some bad side effects from the drug. Those bad side effects may be so bad that they overpower the good effect that the drug has on the disease we're treating. So if that really is the situation, then it could be justifiable to do this clinical study. But the investigator has to be willing to accept that and live by the rules of randomization. If the investigator really honestly believes one or the other of those things is the overriding factor, then that investigator can't do a fair clinical trial. Okay. What should the role of the university be in this decision? what's going to happen here with, how is the university going to work with in deciding what happens? Okay. Again, remember the NIH or whoever or whoever you know, gives grants to do research is technically contracting not with Dr. Walsh but with the university. So the university is responsible. Now, this study is not funded by the NIH, right? This study is funded by the drug company. But still, if the university receives NIH grants, the NIH expects that these standards of conflict of interest should be applied to all the research going on in that university. So the university is responsible for making sure that the conflict of interest is adequately managed. So the university is the one who's going to have the role in determining whether there is a conflict of interest, and if there is one, which I think there clearly is here, how you know, how that should be managed. Going on to question 5. During the first few patients, it becomes apparent to Dr. Walsh that she can tell who is on the active drug because the patients get a facial flush. Might that further influence her ability to remain objective, and what considerations apply in answering that question? Well, first of all, if something like that happens, what would, I guess you haven't done clinical trials yet, but of course the first thing that Dr. Walsh would have to do if that happened is immediately report that result to the group monitoring the clinical trial. In other words, you couldn't say, okay, I know who's getting which drug, but that's just going to be my little secret. You know? Can't do that. You have to report that immediately. Okay, again, I realize that most of you are not currently involved in clinical trials, but it often happens that basic scientists, I think many of us kind of have that secret hope that, you know, we're working on something basic, but we kind of hope someday it might develop into something not so basic and applied. So again, keep these things in mind. Okay. I'm going to skip through some and just go on to just discuss a little bit a special kind of conflict of interest, which is mentorship. There is inherently a certain conflict of interest between students and their advisors. Again, students and advisors share a lot of interests. I'm not going to tell you do war with your advisors, you know, but we and the students have a lot in common. We both want good science to be done. We both want to get papers out. We want to get grants funded. We want to, you know, I as a faculty member want to document that I've produced a whole bunch of PhDs. My PhDs want to get their PhDs and go on to prestigious postdoctoral fellowships and permanent appointments. I want them to do that also. But there's also sometimes a conflict of interest. You know, for example, if I have a very good student who's cranking along in my lab and doing great work, that student may want to move on and leave my lab. And I might say, well, I want the student to leave my lab too, but maybe next year. Right now, I'd rather they cranked out 2 more papers, and we'll worry about them leaving next year. So there's a bit of a conflict. I mean, hopefully it's not a major conflict, and hopefully it's a conflict that can be discussed. But there is that conflict. And hopefully the advisor is there not only to train the student in the scientific technology, but also to mentor them in their professional advancement. One thing to bear in mind in the conflict of interest, though, on the industrial collaborations, though, is there's another potential problem here in that I, as a faculty member, might be perfectly happy to work with a company doing research that doesn't get published. That's not such a big deal for me as a faculty member. On the other hand, for a student to do research that doesn't get published is a disaster, because if the student does research that doesn't get published, the student doesn't graduate. So it's very important. So again, this can be a conflict of interest in that it's perfectly all right for faculty to have some work going on in their lab in collaboration with industry that might not necessarily be leading to a publication, for example, because of patent or maybe the publication might be quite delayed. But presumably that would be work that would be done by a technician and not by a student. Now, in terms of, I'm not going to go into great detail into mentorship, but just in terms of looking at how students and their faculty mentors can interact, there is a very nice web source here where they have the Student Advisor Compact, which is drawn up by the American Association of Medical Colleges. And this is a recommended kind of little contract, just a couple of pages long, which maybe students and their advisors should sign and come to an agreement. Now, whether that's formally done or informally done may vary from person to person and from place to place, but I think it's a good thing for students to look at as you're matching with your advisors and seeing your career develop. You know, think about how you're going to be interacting with your advisor and setting up ground rules. Another thing that's coming very much into fashion, both for students and postdoctoral fellows, is for every trainee to have an individual development plan, and for that individual development plan to be subject to annual review. So, you know, when I was a graduate student, you know, I walked into the lab and my advisor said, here's a project, and I thought that was a pretty cool project, and I worked on it, and things went well. In fact, we published a lot of papers together, and everyone was happy, but, you know, we didn't really think about individual development plan. But what's probably the best way to do this is set up a plan initially when you match with your advisor, and then to meet at least once a year, if not more often, both with your advisor and with your advisory committee, and review, okay, what are the goals of this project? What are the goals of you as a trainee? What progress has been made in the last year? Are we going in the right direction, or are we going fast enough? Is there something that the advisor should do different? Is there something that the student should do different? Is the student working hard enough? Are the goals unrealistic or realistic? Maybe the goals should be changed. Maybe this is a project that's going to take 20 years, and we should think about a project that's going to take more like 4 or 5 years. So again, having continual review is a way of improving mentorship. And you know, there are various little tricks like the compact and like the IDP, but the main thing is to have frequent meetings and reviews just to make sure things are going in the right direction. Fortunately for most advisors and most students, things do go in the right direction, but every little bit of help improves things, and there's always room for improvement, especially when it comes to your professional development, which extends to more than just doing the next lab experiment. And again, there are some resources that you and your colleagues and your advisors may want to look at for advice on how to develop as a young professional and how to advance your career.